Hello everyone. Tonight we start with the strange, slow-motion decline into death of Henry VIII, the titan of the Tudor dynasty, whose life was full of women, battles, and highly dubious axe-related judgments. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from around the globe, so please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. Henry VIII was the golden boy of Renaissance England during the height of his rule. Tall, athletic, broad-shouldered, and, according to everyone, a total hottie in tights. You might mistake him for a highly ornamented recliner with anger management problems in his later years. Henry had commenced what historians kindly refer to as his decline by the 1540s. His weight had skyrocketed to over 300 pounds, primarily in the middle, and he was afflicted with a lovely concoction of ailments, including gout, chronic leg ulcers, and the general side effects of eating meat that was on the verge of being outlawed. His spectacular transition from prince to pudding is worthy of its own Greek tale, complete with sauce. It was more than your average royal excess. Henry felt a great deal of agony. His ulcerated legs throbbed all the time, every joint hurt, and he smelled like something you wouldn't serve in a bar in the 14th century. He was unable to walk unassisted, ride a horse, or even climb stairs. The great king's image had to be preserved, even though his once wonderful codpiece now acted primarily as a barrier between him and reality. He remained broad-shouldered and stout in portraiture, with eyes that suggested, "I'm full of divine purpose," rather than, "I've been sitting in this chair so long that my armor has fused to it." His tailors found it difficult to keep up. His last suit of armor, according to one source, required a 54-inch waist, and that's being generous. He was slowly, openly, and with a large budget, withering behind the velvet and gems. Servants prayed not to be placed on foot duty, courtiers avoided standing too close, and his doctors attempted everything from lancing to poultices, but the majority of treatments resulted in the same thing: pricey linen soaked with royal ooze. By the end of his life, Henry VIII's most well-known physical attributes were his legs, or, more specifically, what had happened to them, rather than his beard, his codpiece, or even his marriage history. What could only be described as royal terror evolved from minor injuries sustained in a jousting accident in his 30s. Chronic ulcers, deep, festering lesions that refused to heal and continuously leaked fluid, became a problem for his legs. Imagine sitting on top of 2 contaminated meat bags and attempting to govern a kingdom. That's what Henry did every day. In addition to being excruciating, the sores were famous. Across the room, guests made comments about the odor, not for political reasons, but rather because they didn't want to breathe close to his ankles. Ambassadors feared court audiences. The sores were reportedly so deep that bone could be seen through them. The word ooze appears frequently in letters from that era. This would have been Act 1 of Shakespeare's body horror play. They slapped it with herbs and hoped for divine intervention, which is another way of saying that the top medical minds of the 16th century were called in. Poultices of honey, rose oil, and anything else sounded faintly church-approved were among the treatments. They tried cauterization as well. Yes, burning the wounds shut, which naturally did not please Henry, and the lancing came next. Oh, the lancing! A daily practice of using cloths and knives to drain the wounds. Imagine having to say, "Good morning, Your Majesty. I'm here to stab your legs again every morning as a doctor." Trauma is likely the cause of the high number of young deaths among court physicians. Together with his renownedly lavish diet, Henry's ulcers also made it practically hard for him to exercise, which led to a vicious cycle of decline. The strain on the wounds increased with weight. Pain increased with pressure. Mood swings increased with discomfort. Additionally, more mood swings indicated that someone close was most likely being fired, banished, or worse, getting married again. Henry VIII's daily menu is a perfect example of what would happen if a man attempted to eat his way into sainthood or out of reality. He didn't just eat too much, they were almost turned into weapons. Just breakfast might consist of a few eggs, chunks of beef, ale-soaked white bread, and perhaps a roasted partridge to aid in digestion. Fruit and vegetables, unless they landed on the roast by mistake, all were utilized as adornment. Meat was associated with manhood in the Tudor court. Your rule is more heavenly the more flesh you have on your plate, and that was a personal issue for Henry, bless him. Game birds, venison, lamb, eel pies, and roasted swans are all covered in sauce, gravy, or symbolic meaning. He ate it if it ever breathed. It was most likely employed to thicken something that did if it didn't. What's his favorite treat? Red wine. Every day, gallons of it. Water was not for rulers, it was for peasants and for cleaning wounds. His body was probably 60% Cabernet by the end. Let's now discuss portion size. His meals were made in bulk, not only for himself, but also for a whole royal household of musicians, servers, taste testers, and whatever group he was favoring at the time. Henry ate as though death may interrupt every meal, even when the entourage was taken into account. Warning. Eventually, one was. Naturally, the effects of this high-fat, low-vegetable, high-gout diet were felt. His digestion was notoriously volatile, aside from the notorious ulcers. His bloating, pain, and, let's say, loud distress were frequently reported by royal physicians. One of his post-feast moans reverberating through Whitehall would likely be a good timer for your pocket watch. Henry continued to refuse to change. He insisted on enormous servings, even though by the last years of his rule he could hardly chew with his decaying teeth. Food at banquets had to be prepared ahead of time so he wouldn't become tired. It was even turning into an aerobic exercise to hoist a turkey leg. In every overindulgent monarch's life, gravity eventually prevails. That moment came to Henry VIII, somewhere in his mid-40s, but it wasn't a knock on his door. Gout, obesity, and progressively aggravated ulcers were all part of the marching band when it arrived. By that time, Henry's body needed logistical planning because he had become so big and immovable. The heyday of athletic struts about the court and jousting competitions was over. Now it took several attendants, pulleys, and something like emotional inducement to get him out of bed. He was moved more than he walked. To move him around his palaces, royal engineers supposedly created a motorized chair that was a cross between a strengthened wheelchair and a throne on training wheels. His armor was specially made to support the sheer weight of the royal volume, not for combat. One of his sleeves might have contained a courtier. Getting on a horse? Ignore it. To get him into the saddle, they had to construct a hoist system. Yes, a real crane for monarchs. The horse probably reassessed its career decisions even at that point. Once seen as honorable, exercise had turned into a fiction. He could only move by turning to shout at someone, and even then it took effort. Gentle movement, such as taking a few steps each day, was advised by his doctors. However, Henry favored political killings than hard work. It significantly improved morale while burning fewer calories. Not only was this bodily deterioration inconvenient, it was risky. His circulation, his attitude, and his already unfriendly digestive system all deteriorated with inactivity. Being a king also makes everyone's health a concern. How far he could be rolled was the focus of entire days. It was necessary to shorten even judicial ceremonies. The king was expected to remain sitting for as long as possible during state occasions. Had there been a treadmill in the royal room, it would have been merely symbolic, or power a spit roaster. However, nobody dared to publicly admit that the most powerful man in England was literally burdened by his own decisions. Smell is one of the most memorable, or hard to overlook politely, of all the humiliations that come with royal decline. And in his last years, Henry VIII was said to have possessed an aroma that came before him. In Tudor England, body odour wasn't very uncommon. Back then, standing downwind was the best way to deodorize, perfume was seen as a medical treatment, and bathing was more theory than practice. However, even in the 16th century, Henry's fragrance was amazing. The offender, his notorious ulcers on his legs. These were not minor injuries. Wrapped in silk stockings and denial, they were vast, festering and continuously draining infections. What the royal doctors could do, they did. Herbal compresses, honey dressings and repeated lancing. However, when the king's lower limbs threatened to proclaim independence, there's only so much you can do. As a result, the palace hallways were plagued by an unpleasant stink. It was common for courtiers to quietly withdraw in the middle of a discussion. During meetings, ambassadors were said to wear fragrant cloths to their faces, which was the Renaissance equivalent of tactical air support. Then there was the issue of his overall cleanliness. Regular bathing became unfeasible due to the persistent agony and near impossible mobility. Henry instead used oils, powders, and layers of luxurious materials that were meant to absorb shame. In the hopes that no one would notice what was rotting underneath, he effectively mummified himself in linen and velvet. They saw the spoiler. He even gave up his own clothes. His clothes were reportedly required to be burned rather than cleaned after each use, which is a fitting metaphor for how much of his dignity was now viewed as expendable. No one dared to discuss it with him in spite of everything. Should you even wrinkle your nose in the wrong way, you could be sent to the Tower of London, or worse, be ordered to change his bandages. Indeed, that was a real job. We all owe them a moment of silence, even though historians are unaware of their identities. Being a king or queen is difficult enough. Being in excruciating pain, leaking from several orifices, and gradually sinking into your own furniture makes it even more difficult. Henry VIII was mentally unstable toward the end of his reign, in addition to being physically immobile. He was crying at the memory of his late wife, Jane Seymour, one minute. The next he was calling someone out for treason because they blinked too much. There was perpetual psychological whiplash in his court. His eyebrow tilt was interpreted by servants in the same manner as sailors read clouds before a storm. He's scowling. It's either war or constipation. Henry had not always been this way, of course. He had been brilliant, charming, and even playful earlier in life. However, the mood swings increased in severity along with the ulcers. The erratic Henry of the past had given way to a king whose main instrument of foreign diplomacy was anger. In addition to his physical illnesses, medical historians believe he may have experienced untreated melancholy, chronic pain-induced irritability, and probably head injuries from a jousting accident in 1536. However, leeches, prayer, or blaming the French were the usual remedies for a poor mood in 16th century England. Unfortunately, no one could urge him to rest because he was king. Rather, advisers grinned uneasily and concurred with his statements. "We'd want to keep our necks, please," is a polite way of saying that some people even complimented his divinely inspired rage. The outcomes were disorganized. During one of Henry's mood swings, dozens of courtiers were banished, imprisoned, or put to death for no other reason than that they had fallen out of favor. Thomas More, his long-standing friend and chancellor, was also not exempt, demonstrating that Henry's inner circle was more akin to a revolving door. Everyone at the royal court, with the exception of Henry VIII, could see the end was near by January of 1547. He was disintegrating in every manner. But legally you couldn't say that. Royal physicians were the most nervous, overqualified performers in history because it was considered treason to foretell the king's death under Tudor law. Henry had to stay in bed. Bed-dwelling, not merely bedridden. He had ruled England in his last days from beneath a pile of embroidered cushions and dubious rulings, and he hadn't rode or walked in years. By Tudor standards, his hunger was down, his breathing was laboured, and his legs were bloated. He continued to eat as if he was unaware that his will would soon become the most significant document in the nation. Nobody dared say that he was dying, even though it was clear that he was. Courtiers created an extensive lexicon of euphemisms. He's sleeping soundly. His Majesty is in a contemplative state of mind. The king is just actively digesting. Even his physicians avoided talking about it. According to reports, one doctor said, "God willing, His Majesty shall recover." A safe assertion with divine support that is ambiguous and non-committal. In the meantime, said Majesty was fading in and out of consciousness, most likely experiencing hallucinations related to Protestant diplomacy and roast goose. However, Henry VIII had papers to complete, even as he deteriorated. He put his signature on papers. He made changes to his will. For his 9-year-old son, Edward, who would shortly inherit the kingdom with a debt equivalent to France, he established a regency council. These were not the grandiose last deeds of a king. They were written orders from a very ill guy whose court acted as though he was only having a little period. The fact was known to those around him. Courtiers, servants, and even the rats in the palace floorboards most likely detected a change. Nevertheless, they waited, because the English king could not pass away until it was safe to do so, and nobody wanted to go first at this point. Henry VIII vacillated between royal insanity and clarity as January drew on. His mind still had policies to yell, people to ignore, and a nation to act as though he wasn't dying in front of, even while his body was shutting down. Perhaps thicker than his ankles, the denial was. He didn't make any official admissions, say any heartfelt goodbyes, or say any dramatic closing remarks. Rather, he gave directives, made changes to the council, and rearranged the power players in the typical paranoid fashion, in case any of them had amusing ideas after his inevitable, and most definitely not imminent, death. And above all, he completed the succession plan. Edward, his ailing 9-year-old son, would ascend to the kingdom with a carefully chosen team of advisers at his side. It should be mentioned that these individuals exhibited about as much loyalty and a propensity for backstabbing as a barrel full of Tudor eels. In addition, Henry had his opulent tomb, which he had been designing for decades, finished. As a spoiler, it was never completed. The thing that endured despite his power-hoarding and micromanagement was paperwork. He did a remarkable job of leaving religion in the dark. Although not overly Protestant, England was nevertheless somewhat Protestant. Without making any doctrinal commitments, they were just Protestant enough to annoy Rome. It was the equivalent of whispering something under your breath and hastily leaving the church. Henry refused to accept that the end was near, even in his last days. He avoided clerics like a man evading jury service when they asked if he wanted to make peace with God. According to one story, he finally muttered, "I'm lost." Even yet, the court couldn't be certain if he was referring to his soul, the kingdom, or a missing turkey leg. The palace, meantime, has a rigorous "don't say he's dying" rule. They were quickly taken away if someone was found using terms like last rites or funeral preparations, not out of disdain, but more to destroy the appearance that the most powerful person in England wasn't dying in his own bed. Henry VIII's deathbed confession, a Shakespearean monologue on misdeeds, regrets, and the 6 wives he either wedded, killed, or lost, is what one would expect in the grand tradition of royal drama. We were met with silence instead, or worse, clarity in administration. Yes, there were priests by his bed. However, they were primarily decorative. Henry was suddenly very silent about his spiritual affairs, despite having renamed the entire Church of England in order to dissolve a marriage and experiment with theology on his own terms. No grandiose request for pardon, no contrite confession. I apologize for his conversation with his daughter Mary about decapitating your mother. Maybe he didn't think he had anything to admit. This was a man who, after all, felt that God himself had approved of all of his choices, even the more clumsy ones. He had not, in his opinion, failed ethically. Wives with obnoxious survival instincts and papists had just been misinterpreting him for a long time. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer reportedly showed up just in time to inquire as to whether the king still believed in Christ. Squeezing his hand while barely aware, Henry VIII reportedly made an ambiguous sign. Was it confirmation? Was it a spasm of muscles? Was he just irritated that the archbishop had failed to bring wine? He would never come close to making a final confession until that squeeze. The fact that his last hours were occupied with paperwork, delegation, and evasive gestures on spiritual matters rather than introspection is striking for a guy who was fixated on control. Henry died reallocating, whereas other kings died repenting. And although he had referred to himself as the Church of England's highest head on earth, he now met death with a nod and a twitch of his hand. Apparently, an exit interview was not part of divine authority. However, that might have been the most Henry course of action. Just the gradual, steady decline of a man who always favored the voice of his own laws over the echo of his conscience. No apologies, no monks crying. With no dramatic closing remarks, no lyrical resolution, and no sign whatsoever that he believed anything had gone wrong, Henry VIII passed away. The audience did not burst into somber declarations or lament when Henry VIII eventually stopped breathing on January 28, 1547. It hesitated for a moment, then stood clumsily for a while before silently panicking, because this is the problem. Declaring the king dead without extremely precise permission was against the law. Everyone in the room became very interested in acting as though Henry VIII was only sleeping, maybe very deeply and permanently, because it was considered treason under Tudor rule to insinuate the monarch had died, even if he was obviously dead. As they stared at one another, doctors, courtiers, and priests waited for someone to blink first. Nobody did. There were no trumpets, no national mourning, no news release, just the solemn silence of men wondering what to do next. In the end, they decided to keep quiet for a few days, not out of deference, but rather as a tactic. As the council convened, the 9-year-old heir, Edward, informed everyone that he now officially owned everything in England, including some very irate neighbours, and that the succession still needed to be managed. In the meantime, Henry VIII's corpse remained in Whitehall Palace, still king in title, but now more physiologically aspirational. Ministers gently organised his affairs while saying he was still unavailable, which wasn't a lie, just a stunning understatement. With all the nuance of a Shakespearean farce, palace workers started preparing while no one used the term dead. Seals were changed, mourning attire was discreetly ordered, and some opportunists likely began dusting off family trees to demonstrate that they were the boy king's 12th cousins and thus entitled to land. Not even foreign diplomats were immediately informed. French and Holy Roman diplomats continued to negotiate with courtiers who gritted their teeth and hoped no one would detect the subtle odour of royal decay coming through the velvet curtains. The entire nation was being led by a guy who, as far as the law was concerned, was still alive, only abnormally quiet, not currently moving, and soon to need a very large coffin. The royal managers were faced with a fresh and pressing problem as soon as Henry VIII was declared dead, if not instantly. How should the body be handled? Additionally, the body had its own opinions, primarily regarding disintegration, which was regrettable for all parties. The man was huge, let's face it. He weighed somewhere north of 300 pounds, and not a trim, symmetrical 300, more of a melting, magnificent pudding form. Years of intense Tudor eating had left his body rife with sores and illnesses. Naturally, it started to disintegrate more quickly than anticipated, a lot quicker. The king was being preserved by attendants and embalmers in the cold corridors of Whitehall Palace. However, this was not the refrigeration heyday. Simple embalming techniques included packing the body with spices and encasing it in layers of cloth à la royale lasagna. Cloves and cinnamon were supposed to drown out the stench of rottenness. You guessed it, they didn't. The body started to leak, slowly at first, then rapidly, in spite of their best attempts. A concoction of bodily fluids soaked through the coffin, resulting in nausea, disorientation, and discomfort. It became so terrible that the coffin was said to have a dark stain and a strong odor that alarmed the horses and, in one now famous story, drew stray canines during the funeral procession to Windsor. Dogs indeed. He undoubtedly didn't envision his legacy being honored by licking the drippings from the former leader of the Church of England. To exacerbate the situation, the coffin had been hurriedly sealed. Royal haste triumphed over artistry. Internal gases caused it to enlarge and supposedly crack. It wasn't the Tudor equivalent of Tupperware. Everyone made an effort to maintain a straight face. No one brought it up in conversation afterwards, and mourning aristocrats walked across the leaking casket with the respect of folks feigning they couldn't smell anything. It's not often that the malfunctioning body of a monarch makes headlines centuries later. However, Henry VIII was never one to take things lightly, either in life or in death. The sealed wooden casket containing the late monarch rumbled menacingly as the burial procession approached Windsor Castle. You would assume that the body of England's most famous king or queen would be transported in a stately, marble-lined receptacle, or at the very least, one that didn't act like a barrel of overripe flesh. Unfortunately, biology and haste worked together to make this last trip unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. The casket started to leak, literally, not figuratively. The coffin sweated despite efforts to embalm the remains because of heat, internal gases, inadequate sealing, and sheer heft. And we mean oozing when we say sweat. Even while you fervently hope you can, modern chroniclers describe a dark, foul fluid leaking from the base of the Fast Forget. Things worsen. According to a well-known, although potentially fictitious story, dogs were observed licking the liquid underneath the coffin. Imagine it, mourning nobles in black, a regal procession stopped in somber silence, while a few sly hounds eagerly sample what is, by all accounts, the king. Although there were various customs in Tudor England, state funerals were not meant to include the consumption of dogs. However, nobody spoke. The performance must continue. They cleaned the coffin as quietly as they could, with eyes forward, mouths closed, and noses offended. Everyone started to walk again. It was more than just a humiliating spill. It turned into a legend, a sinister little tale that was passed down through the ages. Some saw it as divine vengeance for Henry's brutality. Others saw it as a somber joke about a lifestyle of extravagance. In any case, few kings can say that they were able to spoil a funeral with just their presence. The way Henry VIII ended up is either ruthlessly cynical or gloriously romantic. Not in some imposing tomb of Tudor marble, not in Westminster Abbey with the other great kings. No, almost as an afterthought, the man who destroyed monasteries, broke with the Catholic Church, and proclaimed himself the supreme head of the Church of England, was buried in a modest crypt under the floor of St. George's Chapel. His real love, Jane Seymour, who gave birth to a male heir, and passed away before she could let him down, was positioned next to him. That's it. No golden tomb, no imposing monument, just a slab on the floor that didn't even have his name on it for more than a century. An inscription was only added during the Victorian era. Henry VIII was sleeping in unmarked anonymity up until that point, a few feet below the boots of tourists and royal rights. The man who once thundered across Europe holding a turkey leg in one hand and papal bulls in the other is buried here. The man who rewrote the spiritual geography of England, decapitated 2 wives and destroyed centuries of religious history, is now buried like a mediocrely prosperous trader. In some ways, the irony is appropriate despite its richness. It's almost appropriate that Henry ended up in a modest, even unintentional place after all the grandeur, power, ceremonies, and political outbursts. No ornate effigy, no lofty altar to his fame, no magnificent grave ordered during his lifetime. Only a lead-lined coffin beneath a church floor, a vanishing memory alongside Jane, and, later, Charles V, whose own demise was, to put it mildly, not subtle. Despite his ambition to control history, Henry VIII was buried in a communal cemetery with little ornamentation and lots of foot activity. Valeria Messalina was born into the limelight, not something that happened to her. She had imperial blood in her veins and was a member of the great Claudian dynasty. Her cousin would eventually become Emperor Nero, while her great-uncle was Emperor Tiberius. In other words, Messalina was born into a household where everyone carried a dagger, if not in their hand, then firmly tucked into their back, and power struggles were more frequent than family banquets. She grew reared in a milieu of high-stakes politics, corruption, and luxury in ancient Rome. Virtue was disregarded in private and extolled in public there. Messalina would have known the rules of this dangerous game from the beginning. Appearances were crucial, loyalty was a currency, and a strategic alliance or affair might mean the difference between exile and promotion. She was married off as a teenager to her cousin Tiberius Claudius Drusus, who is more famously known as Emperor Claudius. Claudius was viewed as an improbable political figure at the time. Being awkward, physically challenged, and seen as a harmless scholar, few people thought he would ever become king. In Rome, however, power had a curious way of showing up in unexpected places. Messalina was only in her 20s when she became Empress of Rome, and she quickly adapted to the position when Claudius unexpectedly became emperor in the upheaval that followed Caligula's assassination. She started changing her image almost immediately, not as a ceremonial wife but as a powerful woman. Behind her young charm and attractiveness was a smart mind that was already planning how to solidify her position. Rome anticipated that its empress would be a representation of grace and modesty. However, Messalina's goals were everything but modest. Being the woman behind the man wasn't enough for her. She desired to be in charge, utilizing sex, charm, alliances, and terror to advance even further. Additionally, she was well versed in the language of secrets in a court where everyone had something to conceal. Valeria Messalina was on the verge of becoming a legend and a cautionary tale in the glittering halls of the empire, where rumors spread more quickly than couriers. She was unlike any ambitious woman Rome had ever seen. Valeria Messalina quickly rose to prominence in Rome after being elected empress, not just due to her title, but also to her use of it. In the imperial court, she did more than simply sit quietly next to Claudius. Claiming to be the devoted wife, she was the one whispering in his ear, influencing choices, setting up weddings, forming alliances, and destroying adversaries. Her impact, however, went beyond politics. Another thing that made Messalina notorious was her purported sexual desire. She is portrayed as Rome's most twisted femme fatale in ancient sources, the majority of which were penned by men with axes to grind. She allegedly sneaked out of the palace at night to work covertly in brothels, competing with prostitutes, and returned before dawn, according to gleefully detailed accounts in Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal. Regardless of whether these stories were true or slander, one thing is certain: Messalina had a reputation that was unmatched by any other empress in history. Every rumor had a plan behind it. She didn't always pick her lovers for fun. Many were strong men, noble heirs, senators, and horsemen. Messalina utilized intimacy in the same manner that other politicians used bribes. If you sleep with her, you could get promoted. If you don't, you could get inexplicably banished or worse. Claudius, on the other hand, continued to live in happy ignorance or deliberate ignorance. Distractions, administrative changes, political squabbling, and his own fears as an underappreciated leader characterized his reign. According to some historians, Messalina used her role as the naive wife, concerned, loyal, and protective, to manipulate Claudius. Some believe he just didn't want to know. The illusion of power he had over his court and his marriage would have been destroyed by the truth after all. Rome, however, was aware. Messalina's adventures were legendary, as evidenced by the rumors in the forums, the jests at the bathhouses, and the disparaging remarks made by rival lords. Even though her name came to represent extravagance and passion, she maintained her firm hold on power. She was even more frightening because of that contradiction: scandalous, yet untouchable. She merged politics and seduction, transforming her bedroom into a battleground and her body into a weapon. She was either feared or adored by Rome's elite, and occasionally both. However, the barriers would not last long, as is the case with all unbridled power, and the empire beneath Messalina's feet grew more precarious the higher she rose. Scandal was not the only aspect of Messalina's reign as empress. A masterclass in manipulation, too. She played the game of Roman politics with scary efficiency, and she knew it very well. She didn't always target her boyfriends. They were more frequently opponents, rivals, threats, or anyone who dared to question her authority as the imperial queenmaker. She was also merciless. The false accusation was one of her favorite strategies. With Claudius frequently preoccupied or uninvolved, Messalina might use a well-placed lie to bring anyone to ruin. She accused noblewomen of insolence, wives of adultery, and influential senators of plotting. Many were forced to commit suicide, were deported, or were put to death. What did they do wrong, causing inconvenience? She was not an isolated individual. Corrupt freedmen, informants, sycophantic magistrates, and friends of Messalina owed their jobs to her. These friends made sure that her opponents were slain before they could respond, blackmailed the weak, and assisted her in carrying out her purges. Ever the aloof monarch, Claudius frequently signed their death warrants without understanding that he was expelling obedient individuals who may have alerted him to the impending storm. However, her most well-known manipulation was extremely intimate. Claudius was in his 50s and Messalina was in her early 20s when they were married. An exploitable power dynamic resulted from that age difference. She maintained a facade of home fidelity by using her youth, attractiveness, and charm as weapons. Claudius thought he had a loyal wife and was famous for showing her devotion in public. Behind his back, however, Messalina wielded that trust like a blade in secret. She further cemented her position by bearing Britannicus, the son of Claudius. As a result, she became the mother of the imperial heir, in addition to becoming an empress. It was an effective screen that prevented even the most audacious of Claudius's advisors from disparaging her. Who would have the audacity to offend the future mother of Rome? But she was weaving a tighter web. She was making more and more enemies. Even her supporters, who were rich from imperial loot, began to murmur about her carelessness. A court based on intimidation and extortion can only endure so long before it collapses. Messalina was oblivious to the fact that her empire of secrets was starting to decay from the inside out. And the folks she'd smashed on her ascent? They were silently and quietly waiting. No queen remains unopposed for very long in the ruthless arena of Roman power. Although Messalina had many enemies, neither a resentful noblewoman nor a cunning senator posed the greatest challenge to her authority. It was Narcissus, a freedwoman. He wasn't by himself either. Behind the scenes, Narcissus, a freed slave who became Claudius's loyal secretary, had enormous power. He controlled access to the emperor, handled imperial communications, and, above all, had Claudius's ear in a way that few others did. Narcissus put up with Messalina's antics for years, possibly even making money off of them. Eventually, though, even he saw how dangerous she was to the empire's stability as well as the emperor's reputation. When Messalina's desire started to show signs of maturity, tensions escalated to unprecedented levels. She was no longer satisfied with scheming behind the scenes and began planning a far bolder scheme to completely replace Claudius. According to some accounts, Messalina started an affair with the attractive senator Gaius Silius, who was not merely another lover, but a strategic collaborator in a covert coup. Silius was powerful, affluent, and frighteningly well-liked. Furthermore, Messalina wanted more than simply him in her bed. She desired for him to hold the throne. While Claudius was still emperor, Messalina even went so far as to publicly wed Silius, according to the ancient historian Tacitus. Depending on how effective she thought her plan would be, it was either a brilliant or insane move. Her life's most audacious political maneuver was that one. It was the one that would shatter her, though. Narcissus was shocked to hear of the nuptials. He was aware of Claudius's tardiness, but even he was unable to overlook such a betrayal. Narcissus could either take matters into his own hands or report it and risk being ignored. The latter was his choice. Narcissus set a trap with swiftness and stealth. After gathering evidence and warning the Praetorian Guard, he built a case that was so compelling that even Claudius was unable to ignore it. The imperial court was on the verge of collapse. Finally, the empress, who had governed with lies, passion, and whispers, had committed a transgression too big to hide. The blades she used to sharpen others were now being used against her. The rival was back, and he intended to take her crown this time. Claudius had been undervalued for years by both Rome and his own wife. He was viewed as feeble, bookish, and susceptible to manipulation, making him the ideal spouse for a cunning emperor such as Messalina. However, even Claudius could not overlook such a major betrayal, a purported marriage to another man. Claudius was first shocked when Narcissus finally brought the bad news to the emperor. Had his son's mother, his cherished wife, wed someone else in the middle of the day? Narcissus told him more than that. He demonstrated documents, witnesses, and the actual ceremony. After being surprised, the emperor became enraged. This was no longer chatter from the palace. Treason was committed here. Long seen as too dim-witted to govern, Claudius took unusually bold action. He gave the freedman emergency powers and told him to clean the house while Narcissus guided him. Rome's elite troops, the Praetorian Guard, were called in to destroy Messalina rather than defend her. Narcissus hurried while Claudius went back to the palace, pale and silent. Captured in the middle of the festivities, Gaius Silius was hauled out into the street and put to death without a trial. In a ruthless campaign of political housecleaning, his allies, those who had supported the coup or who had simply known too much, were apprehended and killed. What about Messalina? She didn't flee, she didn't conceal anything. In an odd, almost tragic turn of events, she thought Claudius would pardon her until the very end, that she would be saved once more by her beauty, her charm, and her status as his heir's mother. She even ran away to Lucullus's gardens, pleading for an opportunity to talk to him and give an explanation. However, Claudius had stopped listening. At last, the man she had been manipulating had severed his ties. Claudius was hesitant to order her execution at first. He still appeared conflicted in spite of everything. However, Narcissus took action first, out of concern that Claudius may falter. He dispatched a centurion with a message and a knife, either be carried through the forum in shame or die with honor. Unusually paralyzed by terror, Messalina attempted to stall. Despite taking the dagger, she was unable to utilize it. The centurion had to do it for her in the end. Alone, terrified and helpless, the empress who had ruled Rome with sex and silence passed away in a garden. The most notorious woman in imperial history vanished in an instant. There was a chilly, unsettling silence in the imperial court after Messalina's death. It was more than just a scandal's conclusion. An era was being erased. Publicly stoic, Claudius wanted her name removed from official documents. They dragged statues down. Defacement of inscriptions occurred. Records that referenced her actions were either changed or covertly deleted. They told Rome to forget its empress. However, how can one forget a woman such as Messalina? Now that she was gone, the city muttered even more. Tales of her last moments spread like wildfire. According to some, she prayed till her death for Claudius to save her. Defiant to the last, others claimed she cursed him. In any event, her memory did not fade as readily as her portraits did. The clean-up of politics went on. Silius and his followers were only the start. Now wary of everyone, Claudius started purging his court with a hint of paranoia. Previously dining with Messalina resulted in the dismissal, imprisonment, or execution of freedmen and officials. Eager to show loyalty, the Senate voted motions condemning her betrayal, describing it as a stain on the now righteously clean empire. Britannicus, Messalina's infant son and heir apparent, was the only one who had not been affected. Claudius was unable to discipline the youngster for his mother's transgressions, but every aspirational noblewoman in Rome saw that Messalina's passing had created a power vacuum. Powerful families started scheming behind closed doors to replace the deceased empress. Furthermore, Claudius was more exposed than ever due to his mental turmoil and political sway. This was not a time of recovery. It was a reset, a shaky, perilous silence. Claudius had lost faith in everyone around him and was even more dependent on his freedmen, particularly Narcissus, who now had such power that he was essentially in charge by proxy. In the meantime, Rome started revising its beloved bedtime tale. Messalina was more than just a notorious adulterous empress. She turned into a warning story and a symbol of female passion and betrayal. Twisted and amplified, her legend grew stronger in death than it had ever been during her lifetime. The Roman imagination had not forgotten her, but the imperial narrative had. Her ghost would linger in the shadows of the Palatine Hill, whispered about, laughed at, feared forever, while her body was buried in obscurity. Claudius found himself in a precarious situation following Messalina's execution, an emperor without an empress, a parent with a weak heir, and a court full of opportunists eager for power. To stabilize the palace and run the imperial household, the empire needed a new matron. However, Claudius was hesitant to get married again, since he was still hurt by betrayal. Agrippina the Younger comes next. She was smart, gorgeous, cunning, and dangerous in her own right, everything Messalina had been and more. However, Agrippina was not careless like Messalina. She worked methodically. She was the daughter of Germanicus, Caligula's sister, and the mother of a son named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who would go on to become Nero. She was born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Agrippina could see her opportunity. She took the long view. Agrippina negotiated where Messalina had enticed. She persuaded Claudius that the imperial dynasty would regain its honor if he married her. She pledged allegiance, law and order, and, above all, a cohesive dynasty. As he grew older and more influenced by his inner circle, Claudius finally consented. Despite being contentious because of their family ties, their marriage was approved by a special Senate decision. She succeeded as Rome's next empress. However, this was not a romantic tale. Sharing the throne was not something Agrippina was interested in. She wanted to be in charge of it, therefore she promptly started to eliminate any of Messalina's remaining supporters in order to keep the old empress's name and her son Britannicus's claim to the throne hidden. She separated Claudius from his former advisors, appointed her own people to important positions, and started preparing her son Nero to succeed him as emperor. She gradually destroyed Messalina's legacy using memory as well as politics. What about the Romans? They looked on in confusion. Agrippina, some whispered, was simply Messalina with better publicity. Others thought she was far more dangerous. Agrippina ruled with precision and calculation, whereas Messalina had done so with fervor and impulsivity. Agrippina never revealed her hand until it was too late, in contrast to Messalina's overplayed hand. Although the empire had exchanged one queen for another, it seemed unlikely that Rome had learnt its lesson. Claudius had lived through one cunning wife. The next one would not be his. Thus, Messalina's ghost persisted. It only transformed, reincarnating in the aspirations of a new woman who rose from the ashes. Britannicus, Messalina's son, was a tragic remnant of a disbanded dynasty after his death. Even though he was still Claudius's biological son and the legitimate successor, his future was now in jeopardy. When his mother was put to death when he was just a boy, the palace that had once celebrated his birth abruptly turned into a gold cage. Britannicus was initially kept close by Claudius, who even assigned him dependable tutors and guards. The emperor continued to hope that his lineage would provide a legacy. However, Agrippina the Younger, who had no intention of allowing Messalina's child to hold the imperial throne, discreetly and effectively destroyed that prospect. Nero, Agrippina's own son, was older than Britannicus and much easier to manage, particularly under her guidance. In order to displace Britannicus from the line of succession, she launched her campaign. She painted him as a childish, gullible, and unsuited ruler. She put forth a lot of effort to raise Nero at the same time. She arranged for Claudius to adopt him, gave him titles that indicated his rise to power, and gave him the name Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. Britannicus was no longer Rome's golden boy by the time he entered puberty. His supporters were either silenced or banished, and he was a prisoner in his own house under constant surveillance. Agrippina's soldiers even took the place of his previous teachers, guaranteeing that the young prince was raised in a climate of political distrust and seclusion. As he grew older and more manipulative, Claudius appeared to distance himself from his son. As if to erase the guilt of his previous marriage by deleting their kid, he heaped Nero with honors and progressively removed himself from the memory of Messalina. Being marginalized by power politics, Britannicus became a symbol of what might have been a rightful heir, and he was aware of it. According to ancient accounts, he became resentful, afraid, and cautious. He might have feared the same destiny after recalling his mother's collapse. With little resistance, Nero was proclaimed emperor after Claudius inexplicably died, most likely from poisoning, probably by Agrippina. Now a teenager, Britannicus was viewed as a danger. A year later, the boy unexpectedly passed away at a banquet. What is the official cause? Epilepsy. The actual reason? According to the majority of ancient accounts, poison was administered on Nero's orders. Messalina's legacy perished along with her son, and the imperial line she so valiantly attempted to establish was destroyed, not by combat, but by a dinner plate. Even though Valeria Messalina passed away in shame, her legacy persisted. She actually got more immortal the more the empire worked to forget her. She evolved from a real-life empress throughout the ages to become a myth, the quintessential representation of female depravity, desire, and treachery in Rome. However, was that reputation created or earned? Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, hostile men who showed little empathy for powerful women, particularly those who dared to act independently, provide nearly all of the surviving descriptions of Messalina's life. She didn't seem like a political figure to them. She was a dangerous lady who weaponized her sexuality and tainted the empire's innocence, making her a cautionary story. They described her alleged incessant relationships, public marriage to another guy, and midnight visits to brothels. However, more than any proof, the tone of moral panic permeates all of these stories. Some contemporary historians are starting to wonder if Messalina's notoriety was exaggerated for the sake of a story. After all, strong women in Rome were nearly always recast as monsters, especially those who lost favor. Consider Cleopatra. Consider Agrippina. An ambitious woman was either a model of virtue or a covert seductress in a patriarchal society. Conveniently, Messalina became the latter. However, one reality endures even if the exaggerations are removed. She was a powerful figure in the Roman court. Whether via charm, intimidation, or cunning, she used soft power to establish her son's claim to the throne, eliminate rivals, and maneuver through a treacherous political terrain. She worked. Not only did her own story come to an end with her disgrace, it helped Nero gain power in the end, changed the course of Roman succession, and opened the door for Agrippina. Her ambitions' reverberated long after she passed away. Messalina became the quintessential empress, femme fatale, and scandal personified in literature, art, and popular culture. Behind the reputation, however, might have been a woman trapped in a system that penalized power abuse, particularly when it came to female manicured hands. In addition to scandalizing an empire, Messalina made it face its anxieties over women, power, and the price of influence. And that was her most hazardous legacy, more so than any affair. As the co-author of the Federalist Papers, the creator of the country's financial system, a man whose ambition knew no bounds, and a brilliant thinker, Alexander Hamilton stands out among the other founding fathers of America. Beneath the well-polished speeches and powdered wigs, however, was a man who let his private life to descend into such a spectacular disaster that it became the first political sex scandal in the nation. Everything started in 1791. As President George Washington's first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton was at the height of his political influence. His nights, however, became darker as he balanced the national debt throughout the day. One night, a young woman named Maria Reynolds showed up at his house in Philadelphia, saying her husband had left her and pleading for money. After agreeing to help, Hamilton started an affair with her that lasted for a year. The affair turned political in addition to being personal. James Reynolds, Maria's husband, learned of the relationship and saw a chance. He opted for extortion rather than an angry confrontation with Hamilton. Hamilton gave Reynolds hush money for more than a year in order to conceal the affair. However, political secrets are like dam cracks. They finally exploded. Political rivals, primarily Jeffersonian Republicans, learned about the controversy. By 1797, Hamilton was accused of financial wrongdoing in addition to infidelity, according to circulating rumors. The inference that he had paid off the Reynolds couple by misusing public monies. It was a charge that would ruin a career. Thus, Hamilton took the unimaginable action. The Reynolds pamphlet, a 95-page confession he composed, described every vile moment of the affair in startling, unrepentant detail. While maintaining that he had never stolen from the treasury, He admitted to having an affair with Maria, paying her husband, and having moral flaws. The consequences were severe. His opponents had a field day, his reputation fell, and Federalists were appalled. Hamilton lost a lot of his clout in Washington's inner circle after being publicly and politically humiliated. But, in true Hamilton form, he fought until the end. He would want to be known as an adulterous rather than a robber. At the expense of his dignity, it was a risk that maintained his integrity. Ultimately, it wasn't an argument or a combat that initially broke the armor of America's most audacious founding father. It was one really comprehensive brochure, passion, and blackmail. Thomas Jefferson is frequently portrayed as the philosopher-president who supported liberty, democracy, and the pursuit of pleasure, and as the idealist who drafted America's Declaration of Independence. However, Jefferson never officially acknowledged the existence of a secret family that was created out of bondage behind Monticello's neoclassical facade. At Jefferson's estate, Sally Hemings was a slave. She was the daughter of a multiracial slave lady and a white slave master, and she was also his late wife's half-sister. Historians were aware of the twisted irony. More difficult still? When Jefferson, in his 40s, started dating Hemings during his diplomatic stint in Paris, Hemings was only about 14 years old. Oral history passed down by Hemings's relatives revealed a different story, one of intimacy, secrecy, and children, than the decades-long dismissal of this relationship as a rumor. What many had long assumed was ultimately proven by DNA testing in the late 1990s. 4 of Hemings's 6 children, whom Jefferson fathered, went on to become adults. Sally Hemings was never set free by Jefferson. He did, however, surreptitiously murder all of her living children. During his lifetime, he only ever released these 2 persons from slavery. Some of them fled in circumstances that were ostensibly well-planned and disregarded. In his will, others received official emancipation. They all appeared uncannily similar to their father as they entered freedom. Jefferson's supporters for a long time portrayed him as a man of moral clarity in spite of overwhelming evidence, but the existence of his secret family dispelled the fiction. How could the author of All Men Are Created Equal both uphold and profit from a system that denied fundamental human rights? To exacerbate the situation, Jefferson maintained exacting documentation. Hemings's children constantly appeared during his visits to Monticello, and he recorded her pregnancies on his plantation journals. The recognition is what's lacking, though. He never publicly mentioned their names, acknowledged the relationship, or confronted the obvious inconsistency between his private and political lives. As for Sally Hemings, she never left any written records. Documents authored by males who viewed her as property have filtered her voice. The tenacity of her children, who went on to establish successful lives as free Americans, provides us with what little we know about her personality. A secret family, concealed behind shutters, born of silence, and compelled to bear both Jefferson's name and his burden, existed in the shadow of his Enlightenment ideals. A printer, inventor, diplomat, and philosopher, Benjamin Franklin was a guy of unparalleled intelligence and curiosity. Beyond the bifocals and rods, however, Franklin had a far more enigmatic side, one that was full of shady societies, pornographic literature, and a social life that would have made most Puritans swoon. The Hellfire Club will be our first topic. Although the extent of Franklin's involvement is up for discussion, he lived in England for years when it was at its most popular. Hedonism, mockery, and disrespect for religion were hallmarks of the Hellfire Club, a covert organization. What is their motto? Do as you please. It was more about scandalous gatherings in secret grottos where elite men congregated to drink, gamble, and indulge in intellectual and carnal delights than it was about demonic worship. Franklin was associated with a lot of these things. During his time as the U.S. ambassador in Paris, he was well known for his love of French salons, which were thought-provoking events that frequently conflate flirting with politics. He loved the company of French women, and they loved him. Even in his advanced years, he was not unfamiliar with amorous liaisons according to letters. He famously wrote, "They don't yell, they don't tell, and they're grateful as hell," after acknowledging that older women were better lovers. Indeed, that was written by the same individual whose visage appears on the $100 bill. Franklin was likewise fascinated by pseudonyms and hidden codes. In order to explore forbidden subjects like religion, sex, and hypocrisy, he regularly published under false identities such as Mrs. Silence Dogood, Polly Baker, and Richard Saunders. In addition to exposing moral inconsistencies and mocking authority, his writing also alluded to his deeper interests in libertine philosophy and alternate ways of thinking. Then there were his private connections. Franklin lived in Europe for many years, even though he was married to Deborah Reed. His letters are full of affection for other ladies and show no signs of infidelity. Although no accusations were ever verified, some historians even theorize that he might have fathered children overseas. It is evident that Franklin had a voracious appetite, both intellectual and otherwise. The strict morals of his Puritan forebears did not apply to him. He actually appeared to like breaking the law, especially when it came to sex, power, and thought. The real Franklin was therefore far more electric, charged with secrecy, mischief, and late-night enlightenment, even though schoolbooks may portray him as a smart, kite-flying innovator. George Washington is sometimes pictured as a guy in a marble statue, fearless, stoic, and incredibly dignified. Beneath the military stance and powdered wig, however, was a very private person with his own set of inconsistencies, fears, and repressed feelings. First, let's talk about something that most people are unaware of. Washington never had much of a desire to take charge. He had concerns about his own qualifications prior to being appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Sincerely, he was concerned that he lacked the expertise and experience necessary to command a war against the British Empire. Even after accepting, he declined a compensation, requesting instead payment for his expenses, perhaps to avoid coming seen as ambitious. He had image issues as well. Washington was preoccupied with what other people thought of him. A large portion of his private letters, especially those that could damage his reputation, were deleted. Among these were possibly amorous letters to one of his friend's wives, Sally Fairfax. Sally appears to have been the focus of Washington's early affections even before Martha. His writings, which are full of poetic desire and subdued passion, imply a strong emotional bond. Speaking of Martha, their union wasn't passionate in the conventional sense, but it was steady and loving. Intimate correspondence between the two was uncommon, and the ones that have remained have a professional, even businesslike tone. After his passing, Martha burned almost all of their private letters, implying that she had feelings or secrets she didn't want history to know. Then there was Washington's anger issue. Despite his reputation for being calm, his private aides documented his outbursts of fury, particularly when the battle didn't go as planned. At one point, he threw his hat to the ground and swore so loudly that the soldiers were stunned and went silent. Although these were private outbursts, they show the emotional strain he endured despite maintaining a composed, in-control facade. In addition, Washington held hundreds of slaves, a fact that is frequently omitted from patriotic depictions. He later emancipated some slaves in his will after displaying moral unease with slavery, but he continued to profit from forced labor rest of his life. In order to avoid their legal liberation, he secretly rotated enslaved workers out of state, circumventing Pennsylvania's gradual abolition legislation. The nation's father had moral compromises, personal regrets, and secret uncertainties. His magnificence and secrets were genuine, and it is in that complexity that humanity's past so frequently erases. John Adams could have been the most eloquent and compassionate of the founding fathers. Behind his tough New England exterior, he was a bright, opinionated, and occasionally irascible guy whose most revealing secrets were written down rather than spoken. And his wife, Abigail, was the only one who was given access to those secrets. One of the closest windows into early American politics and a marriage that was remarkably contemporary for its era is their communication. As other founders buried their personal lives in quiet or disappeared for years, John and Abigail corresponded to each other on a regular basis. There are more than 1,100 letters left. Adams expressed his great devotion, political considerations, disappointments, and concerns in them. Abigail not only provided John with emotional support, but also served as his advisor while he was abroad in Philadelphia or Europe. He frequently sought her views on foreign affairs, economic issues, and the conduct of other revolutionaries. In response, she urged him to keep the ladies in mind, a far-sighted call for women's legal rights. Adams, however, was also prone to paranoia. His position in history caused him much insecurity. He was annoyed by the amount of attention that Washington and Franklin got, and he was afraid that he would be overlooked or forgotten. His letters from retirement were filled with jealousy, annoyance, and a desire for respect, and he watched bitterly as Jefferson rose to prominence as the Republic's favorite after he left office. He was also known for having a challenging personality. Adams believed that the majority of men in government were idiots, and he didn't put up with fools. He was at one time estranged from almost all of the major political parties, had a falling out with Hamilton, and distrusted Jefferson. The Alien and Sedition Acts, which repressed press freedom and civil opposition, were among the controversial policies that characterized his one tenure as president. Adams maintained his moral compass despite all of his shortcomings. Even though it put him in a difficult political and financial position, he was the only founding father to reject to own slaves on principle. He was defined by his calm, unwavering integrity, which seldom garnered media attention. John Adams was ruthlessly honest in print, policy, and passion, yet he was neither polished or revered. And he left behind a legacy that was far more human than heroic in those letters he sent to Abigail at midnight. The creator of the Constitution, James Madison, is frequently regarded as the American Revolution's unsung genius. Behind his quiet demeanor and gentle tone, however, was a man struggling with his own deteriorating physical condition and profound fears in addition to the political unrest. For the majority of his life, Madison was physically weak, standing little over 5 feet tall and weighing less than 100 pounds. He concealed his chronic conditions, which may have included epilepsy, as best he could. His spectral pallor and the abrupt lapses in which he would withdraw from public life to recuperate were frequently seen by friends and political allies. He lived in constant fear of dying from stress or overwork. Madison never bothered to write a memoir since he was so sure that he would die young. He had little hope of living long enough to make a difference. However, he did. Madison was one of the main authors of the Federalist Papers and the man who drafted the Constitution. He seldom took credit, though. He favored working in the background, allowing more outspoken figures like Jefferson and Hamilton to steal the show. While others yelled on the floor, he was the silent manipulator in the back room, creating entire systems of government. A lot of information about his personal life is also revealed via his marriage to Dolly Madison. James was nothing compared to Dolly, vivacious, outgoing, and captivating. Their union was an alliance of power. She made Madison acceptable to the general public by holding renowned political salons in Washington, D.C., where rivals were made friends over her renowned cakes and ice cream. Dolly handled the optics, transforming their home into the social hub of the capital, while Madison planned behind closed doors. Madison, however, had his dark side. He was a complicated slave owner who was reluctant to free his own enslaved workers, but emotionally uncomfortable with the system. Even if he was intellectually careful, his theories did little to threaten the system in the new republic, where he had covert correspondences about the practicalities of slavery. Madison battled loneliness and despair later in life. As his political power declined, he saw how the very forces he had assisted in unleashing distorted his idea of limited government. Although he lacked Washington's grandeur and Franklin's charm, Madison's brilliance helped to shape the American Republic's architecture. Nevertheless, despite his genius, he was plagued by uncertainty, sickness, and the worry that history would forget him. He constructed the stage. Others bowed. America's Revolution was sparked by the fiery writing of Thomas Paine. The spark that propelled colonies toward freedom was ignited by his pamphlet Common Sense. However, in contrast to the other founding fathers, Paine found himself in political exile, forgotten and hated by the country he helped build. Paine wasn't privileged or wealthy from birth. He was an English working-class man who came to America at the age of 37, with little more than Benjamin Franklin's recommendation letter. But everything changed when he wrote in 1776. At the time, Common Sense sold an incredible 100,000 copies. It was written in straightforward, bold terms that the average person could understand. It demanded more than simply independence. It called for it, mocking royalty and promoting the notion that the people should run the country. However, Paine's passion for revolution extended beyond the borders of America. He sailed to France after the United States earned its independence and initially backed the French Revolution. He defended revolt against tyranny in his book, The Rights of Man. He became a hero among French radicals and an adversary of the British Crown as a result. Paine, however, was appalled when the movement descended into violence. In the perspective of the new French government, he was a traitor since he opposed King Louis XVI's execution. Because of a strange twist of fate, the chalk mark that unintentionally saved his life, he was imprisoned in Paris and barely avoided the guillotine. In the meantime, Paine's image was deteriorating in America. The Age of Reason, his second significant work, questioned the Bible's authority and criticized established religion. Despite his professed belief in God, his book was labeled blasphemous by atheists. His old buddies betrayed him. His letters were disregarded by Washington. He was denounced as dangerous by the Federalists. Paine had become a pariah by the time he returned to the United States in 1802. The same guy who had previously sparked a revolution was now despised by civilized society, ridiculed in newspapers, and denied the opportunity to vote in several places. Buried on a small property in New York, he passed away in 1809 destitute and alone. His funeral was attended by just 6 persons. Paine's unwavering honesty, refusal to compromise, and attacks on religion cost him everything else, even though his ideas had contributed to the founding of a nation. The flames scorched him once he lit the fuse. Gouverneur Morris led a life more akin to a risque figure from a scandalous 18th century novel, whereas the majority of the Founding Fathers are renowned for their grim portraits and dry speeches. The final draft of the U.S. Constitution was actually written by him. Constitution, including "We the People," the famous preamble. But his personal life, not at all like a textbook. Morris was vivacious, extravagant, and shamelessly decadent. After losing his leg in an enigmatic carriage accident, which some speculated had less to do with a noble injury than jumping from a jealous husband's window, he had to walk with a cane. In any case, Morris was unfazed by it. The wooden leg really became a sort of hallmark, one additional element that set him apart in the stuffy world of stiff formality and powdered wigs. Morris was well known for his womanizing while working as a diplomat in France during the Revolution. While anarchy swept through Paris's streets, he continued to have affairs with French nobility. The same revolutionary purge that captured Queen Marie Antoinette also captured one lover. He was allegedly rescued from a mob attack by another. Morris, however, was an iconoclast as well as a libertine. While many of his peers either remained silent or benefited from slavery, he publicly denounced it as a wicked institution. He even insisted that the Constitution not be signed unless it preserved the federal government's authority over slavery, a demand that was later weakened. Morris didn't tone things down back home. He had a long history of scandalous romances and mistresses that caused discomfort among his colleagues, but he never married until he was very old. He startled high society at the age of 57 when he married his servant, Anne Carey Randolph, who was at the center of a significant scandal involving claims of infanticide and an alleged abortion. Morris was unconcerned, but the press had a field day. Being the odd man out was nothing new to him. Even his passing was out of the ordinary. Legend has it that Morris inserted a whalebone into his urethra in an attempt to clear a blockage, which resulted in fatal internal damage. The story matches the pattern whether it is factual or not. To the surprise of those around him, Morris lived and died as he saw fit. Gouverneur Morris was a one-legged, sharp-tongued wild card and one of the most fascinating people you've probably never heard of in a room full of powdered wigs and moral posturing. Although the Founding Fathers created a new country with principles of equality, justice, and liberty, their personal lives frequently ran counter to the very liberties they so fervently advocated, and the deliberate erasing of their contradictions expanded along with the fantasies of American greatness. The most obvious hypocrisy was slavery. A large number of the men who proclaimed that all men are created equal either actively supported slavery, owned slaves, or made money off of it. Slaveholders included Jefferson, Washington, Madison, and Monroe. Slaves worked on their plantations while they discussed independence, depriving them of the liberties that the Constitution would subsequently guarantee, while others, such as Franklin and Hamilton, made abolitionist moves. None overthrew the system that enabled their world. Another blind point was women. When the new republic's rules were being drafted, Abigail Adams reportedly pleaded with her husband to keep the females in mind. No, he didn't. Not one of them did. Women were completely excluded by the Constitution. The founders spoke lovingly of their wives and daughters in their private letters, but technically those women had no rights, no vote, and no voice. Then there were the ethical contradictions. Their private lives were characterized by whispered scandals, secret groups, illegitimate offspring, and affairs. However, they wrote of dignity, virtue, and self-control. They maintained inequity at home while denouncing tyranny abroad. Despite their distrust of monarchy, they permitted hereditary authority and dynastic wealth to thrive in their new republic. The discrepancies were known to some. In his last years, Washington suffered much over slavery. Madison wrote extensively about factionalism's perils. In the process of creating the very political party structure he cautioned against, ironically, others, like Jefferson, appeared to be able to divide their life completely, managing slaves in the afternoon and penning thought-provoking philosophical tracts in the morning. However, their contributions are not negated by these shortcomings. They give them a human quality. In togas, the Founding Fathers were not gods. They were ambitious, intelligent, and imperfect men with both public and private convictions and faults. They established a country based on contradictions, many of which still plague the United States today. Their legacies are living arguments rather than marble statues, disputes over morality, power, freedom, and who gets to write history. And we discover not just a nation's beginnings, but also the design of its ongoing conflicts in their covert lives, which are entangled in scandal, contradiction, and compromise. Despite ruling empires and leading epic conflicts, Napoleon Bonaparte was almost laughably weak when it came to love. Behind the tough veneer of a military genius lay a man who was utterly disarmed by passion, particularly in regards to his first wife and most eerie fixation, Josephine de Beauharnais. They had a turbulent beginning to their relationship. A lovely widow 6 years his senior, Josephine utterly enthralled the young general. They courted for a short time before being married in 1796. Napoleon left his new bride in Paris and left almost immediately for his battle in Italy. He started writing letters from the battlefield that show the voice of a man in love and on the verge of despair rather than that of a conqueror. He admits in one letter, "I wake up full of you. My senses have not been able to relax since seeing you and remembering the euphoric delights of last night." He begs, "Don't wash, I'm going home," in another. The letters alternate between deep insecurity, possessiveness, and sexiness. After winning a war, Napoleon would sit down and chastise Josephine for not responding to his letters promptly. Perceiving silence as treachery, he wanted letters every day. His tone frequently shifted from amorous longing to sour accusation in the middle of sentences due to his erratic emotions. Josephine, however, was far less excited. She loved Parisian salons and finally had her own lovers as Napoleon poured forth his soul. Napoleon was devastated to learn of this, and his letters started to show how devastated he was. Even after learning of her adultery, he was unable to move on. His letters were increasingly obsessive and gloomy. He described being eaten, sleep-deprived, and tormented. For her part, Josephine frequently responded with silence or evasive politeness. It was a heartbreaking, one-sided romance. Napoleon continued to hold a torch for Josephine years after divorcing her in 1810 to wed Marie-Louise of Austria for political reasons. Even in exile, he reportedly kept a photograph of her by his bed, and on his deathbed at St. Helena, his last words are claimed to have included her name: France, the army, Josephine, the army commander. Despite his strength, Napoleon was unable to control love. In addition to being historical records, his letters are nonetheless confessions of a man who was destroyed, not by enemy fire, but by a lady who never fully returned his love as he had intended. Frida Kahlo wrote about pain rather than merely painting it. Her love letters to Diego Rivera, the tall Mexican muralist who was the object of her passion and the cause of her most painful scars, are unvarnished, poetic, and brimming with passion. Frida turned her sadness into art on paper and paint, while others attempted to conceal it. Diego and Frida had a notoriously tumultuous relationship. He was a legendary figure who had a reputation for cheating, and he was 20 years her senior. She was the youthful, flaming artist whose heart was prone to volcanic explosions and whose spine had been fused by injury. They were split by treachery and united by passion, making them explosive together. A woman who loved with alarming intensity is revealed in her letters. "Nothing compares to your hands, nothing like the green gold of your eyes," she writes in one. "You have been in my body for days and days." In a different one, "I love you more than I love myself." Frida never concealed her suffering. Line by line, she bled it out. In a loving insult, she referred to Diego as her frog-toad, a moniker that somehow conveyed both her love and her annoyance. Her letters frequently oscillate within a single paragraph between fervent hatred and unwavering adoration. She wrote to Diego with longing rather than disinterest even after his indiscretions, some of which involved Frida's own acquaintances and even her sister. She only asks for presence in her words. "I ask you for violence in the gibberish, and you offer me grace, your light, and your warmth." In 1939, they got divorced. A year later, they got married again. Although their relationship was never stable, their bond was unshakable. Frida wrote as though Diego were oxygen, even while they were apart. Maddening, necessary, and always just out of reach. Her bodily agony also seeped into her letters. Frida characterized her body as a battlefield following her terrible bus accident, which left her in excruciating pain for the rest of her life. Diego was unable to heal it, but he managed to make it bearable. Although she was completely vulnerable, she was never weak. Frida Kahlo's writings are ultimately about more than only Diego. They are about the struggle between identity and love, survival and loyalty. She discovered language in her suffering. She discovered fire via her desire. She also seared herself into history in her fire. One of the greatest love riddles in history is the identity of the woman who inspired some of the most intense letters ever penned by the brooding genius of classical music, Ludwig van Beethoven. Known only as the Eternal Beloved, she only appears in a collection of unsent letters that were discovered among Beethoven's possessions following his death in 1827. These letters lacked a return address, a date, and a name. Simply profound, heartfelt expressions of love that continue to enthrall and perplex academics. One starts with me, my angel, my entire being, and myself. I'm still in bed, but I'm crying again because I'm thinking of you, my eternal love. Keep your cool, love me, and say goodbye to my life, my entire world, and my tears of longing for you. Oh, keep loving me and never misunderstand your beloved's most devoted heart. Beethoven was not renowned for being emotionally transparent. He frequently wrote abrupt, stiff, and sometimes antagonistic letters to other people. But something breaks in these pages. He is intimate, vulnerable, and occasionally totally lost. The desperation that permeates every phrase is even more eerie. He was writing from a point of separation rather than ease. According to the letters, they were separated, possibly prohibited from being together, and trapped in uncontrollable conditions. He describes barriers, concealment, and their inability to publicly unite. For ages, scholars have argued over who this woman was. Giulietta Guicciardi, a former student, Josephine Brunswick, a widowed countess, and married aristocrat Antoni Brentano are the frontrunners. None have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, yet each had close ties to Beethoven at various points throughout his life. The puzzle is still not complete. Beethoven undoubtedly had a special place in his heart for this eternal lover, whether he loved her once or often. She was his inspiration, his agony, and his inaccessible deliverance. Then there was quiet. The correspondence was never sent by mail. Maybe he didn't dare. He might never have been able to. Maybe she was gone already. It was his unsent letters, filled with genuine need and wordless pain, that revealed the softest notes of a man whose symphonies reverberated through the ages. Although his eternal sweetheart is unknown, we may hear her name in every mournful chord, thanks to his ink. One of the most heartbreaking love letters in literary history was written by Oscar Wilde, the renowned Victorian wit, famed for his incisive remarks and opulent prose. It wasn't flirtatious or sweet. A man whose love had destroyed him wrote a 50,000-word epistolary wail. What's its name? De profundis means from the depths in Latin. While serving a 2-year term for gross indecency for his homosexual association with Lord Alfred Douglas, a young aristocrat known as Bosie, Wilde composed it while incarcerated in Reading jail. Their love affair had scandalized society, angered Douglas's powerful father, and led Wilde from salons and champagne to a jail cell. Grief is the letter's starting point, but it soon changes into something more horrific, a confession, an indictment, a reflection on suffering and love. You came to me to discover the joy of life and the joy of art, he writes. Maybe I've been picked to teach you something far more amazing, the beauty and significance of grief. Wilde never quits loving Douglas despite his accusations of conceit, selfishness and desertion. That is the agony. De profundis alternates between betrayal and devotion, resentment and love in each paragraph. It's not just a breakup letter, it's a requiem for Wilde's past life. Wilde also places the responsibility on himself seeing his own blindness and indulgence as fatal defects. He considers how he attempted to shape Bosie into a more profound person, deserving of his adoration. He was instead engulfed. He acknowledges that the relationship caused his financial collapse, public shame, and the decline of his brilliance. De Profundis, however, is more than just a chronicle of suffering. It is a work of philosophy that was inspired by suffering. Wilde describes how Christ is the supreme artist of grief, how suffering fosters empathy, and how his prison experience destroyed all of his illusions. Wilde sent the letter to Douglas after his release, but their bond was irreparable, he writes. Wilde died a few years later, impoverished and in exile. The whole publication of De Profundis did not occur until both men had passed away. Although it isn't a love letter in the conventional sense, it is arguably the most brutally honest one ever composed. It's about what love takes when it's finished giving, not about want. The modernist literary titan Virginia Woolf, renowned for her ferocious intellect and stream of consciousness works, had a quiet storm boiling behind her calm facade. She fell madly and unreservedly in love with Vita Sackville West, a fellow writer, aristocrat, and free spirit, while she was married to Leonard Woolf, a stable and encouraging spouse. It was impossible to classify their relationship. It was passionate, intellectual, emotional, and occasionally physical. Beginning in the 1920s, it blossomed through a series of letters that are still regarded as some of the most exquisite examples of same-sex love in literature. "I am reduced to a thing that desires Virginia," Woolf writes in one of the first letters. "It is astounding how crucial to me you have become." Frequently, the roles were switched. Normally so reserved, Woolf was the one who desired, shattered, and pined. Her letters are filled of humor, subtly expressed desperation, and repressed longing. She found in Vita not only a lover but also an inspiration, a representation of fierce femininity and independence that she loved and admired. Vita, a magical, gender-bending time traveler who personified the essence of her elusive love, served as a direct inspiration for Woolf's masterwork, Orlando. It was a covert love letter as well as a literary experiment. In response, Vita loved Virginia, though her feelings for her were sporadic. In addition to her own complex marriage, she had other lovers and other intrigues. However, her letters to Woolf reveal a lasting bond and a great deal of admiration. "I was expecting to miss you a lot, but I miss you even more than I thought I would." Their correspondence defies convention, which is what makes it so remarkable. These weren't yelled statements from rooftops. These were murmurs on paper, private, cryptic, and filled with desire that went beyond the material world. They continued to correspond until Woolf's suicide in 1941, even after their romantic relationship soured. She is frequently quoted in one of her final letters to her husband, Leonard. Her greatest satisfaction, however, is found in her letters to Vita. Her weakness was exposed by the ink. Woolf and Vita created their own standards for love in a society that attempted to define it in strict terms. They wrote about more than simply love. They were love, beautiful, complex, indefinable, and ever-shifting, like the waves of Woolf's own prose. The tragically brief but emotionally overpowering life of romantic poet John Keats, who gave us lines like, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," was filled with letters to his beloved Fanny Brawne, which he wrote in his last years. Keats died at the age of 25. Despite their covert engagement, Keats knew he would probably never survive to marry Fanny, and their relationship was full of fear, poetry, and intensity. Keats, who was already suffering from tuberculosis, realized he was living on borrowed time. Every word he wrote to her is permeated with that impending death. "I have been astonished that men could die martyrs for religion," he writes in one of his letters. "It has made me shudder. I no longer shudder." Because of my faith, I might be martyred. My faith is love, and I would sacrifice my life for it. I could die for you." Keats' letters are replete with feelings of devotion, beauty, jealousy, and agony. He didn't simply love Fanny, he worshipped her. He called her his goddess, his brilliant star, and he clung to her picture like a lifeline, even in his moments of insecurity, but his illness made everything more desperate. He desired for her presence so much that it physically ached him. He was afraid that she may cease loving him, that he would be a burden, and most of all, that he would die without ever really knowing her as a husband would. The letters are terribly emotional because of that fear and that burning anguish. In one letter he writes, "I almost wish we were butterflies and lived but 3 summer days." His letters were retained by Fanny for the remainder of her life, but she seldom ever mentioned him afterward. "3 such days with you I could fill with more delight than 50 common years could ever contain." When Keats passed away in Rome in 1821, he was laid to rest beneath a stone that only said, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." However, his name did not fade. His poetry and letters to Fanny, pages filled with longing and preserved against the odds, served as a reminder that love can still burn brightly, even in the shadow of death. Emily Dickinson, one of America's most mysterious poets, spent much of her adult life in solitude, seldom leaving her home in Amherst, Massachusetts. But beneath her reticent exterior and cryptic verses was a deep, passionate, emotional world that found expression in letters as mysterious as her poetry. John Keats didn't get a lifetime, but he left behind a love that reads like eternity. 3 letters, never sent and never named, reveal a woman struggling with existential longing and overwhelming love. "Master, open your life wide and take me in forever, but I shall never be satisfied with never." The identity of Master has never been established. Her most intense correspondences were sent to a person she called Master. Whether it was a composite, a symbolic lover, or perhaps a manifestation of heavenly need, the letters are undeniably intimate, passionate, sensual, hurting with suppressed want. Some think it was Charles Wadsworth, a married pastor she liked. Additionally, Dickinson continued to have emotionally charged relationships with women, particularly with her sister-in-law and next-door neighbor, Susan Gilbert Dickinson. Her letters to Susan, which number over 300 and are preserved, are full of romantic language, poetic flirtation, and declarations that conflate romantic love with close friendship. For example, she wrote to Susan, "Susie, will you indeed come home next Saturday and be my own again and kiss me? I am very excited for you and I hope so much for you, for I feel like I can't wait." These were not casual notes. They were torrents of emotion written in slanted, swirling calligraphy. "Feel that now I must have you." It's no accident that many of Dickinson's best poems reflect the tone of her letters, the aching, the obsession, the sacred terror of intimacy. Dickinson never married, and her emotional life was largely hidden during her lifetime, but her letters show a fierce capacity for intense, secret, and poetic love. Emily Dickinson loved in broad, sweeping sentences, but she lived behind closed doors. Her letters, which are fragmented, half-lost, and frequently coded, invite readers into a secret world of affection that is too strong to be publicly announced. Her words flow like riddles, enveloping love in layers of metaphor and punctuation dashes. Dickinson buried her feelings in verse and ink in a world that feared women's feelings, perhaps hoping that someone would one day discover them and comprehend. Winston Churchill is known for his unflappable leadership during the war, his stirring speeches, and his unwavering frown. But beneath the bulldog bluster was a man who was incredibly loyal to his wife, Clementine Hozier, a bond that was documented in an amazing series of love letters that lasted over 50 years. Winston fell in love the moment they met in 1904, and even as bombs dropped and empires collapsed, Churchill made the time to write to Clementine. Their romance lasted only 4 months, and the letters started almost immediately. In one letter, he said, "My darling Clemmy, I hope you will forgive me for writing you such a short letter. But really I am so busy running the British Empire I have scarcely time to keep my head on." His tone, which was often harsh and strong in public, changed to one of gentleness and playfulness in private. Even under the strain of a world war, Churchill never lost his sense of humour. Throughout their lengthy marriage, he was frequently gone on military missions, in Parliament, or leading the country, but his letters remained consistent, and his love never appeared to fade. Although they weren't always in agreement, he referred to her as his cat, and signed letters as Pug, a reference to their nicknames for one another. They wrote not only as husband and wife, but also as lifelong friends, confidants, and emotional pillars. Winston responded with gratitude and candour to one of Clementine's most well-known letters, which was written in 1940 at the height of the war, warning him that he was growing irritable with his staff. Her purpose was not to chastise him, but to support him in continuing to be the leader Britain needed. Churchill reportedly told Clementine that meeting her had caught and conquered him more thoroughly than any battlefield, and he listened to their letters, which struck a balance between tenderness and tension, flirting and strategy. In a world of battle rooms and command centres, Churchill found his greatest solace in the silence of a letter to his wife. No grandeur, no politics, just devotion. He continued to write her loving notes, frequently brief, but always passionate, until near the end of his life. Few love stories in literary history are as brilliant or as destructive as that of Zelda Sayre and F. Scott Fitzgerald, the golden couple of the jazz age, glinting through the roaring 20s with martinis in hand, madness on the horizon, and a pile of love letters trailing behind them like confetti from a broken parade. His legacy may be forged in speeches and triumphs, but the love letters to Clementine remind us that even the hardest men in history frequently live their softest truths in private. In 1918, Zelda was a wild southern belle with a rebellious streak, and Scott was a young army lieutenant. He courted her with letters that were full of desperation, wit, and ambition, such as, "I love you the first moment I saw you, and I'll love you until my last breath." At first, she left him hanging, uncertain that his literary aspirations would ever materialize, but she consented to marry him when his debut novel, This Side of Paradise, became a bestseller in 1920. They were young, wealthy, well-known, and utterly unprepared. Zelda's messages are fun, poetic, flirty, and frequently tinged with her own developing instability. One letter read, "Scott, my darling, I've just washed my hair, and I can't do anything with it, but I love you madly." Admiring her beauty but fearing her independence, Scott's responses were both admiring and possessive. He frequently rejected Zelda's attempts to write, dance, or express herself artistically, arguing that there could only be one writer in the family. As the years went by, their brilliant lifestyle descended into alcoholism, financial ruin, and mutual hostility. Zelda experienced a string of mental breakdowns and extended stays in a sanitarium. That tension blared into their letters, affection entwined with control. A weird yearning sensitivity persisted in their letters even then. Zelda once wrote, "I've tried so many ways of writing to you. I've tried to tell you how much I believe in you." From an asylum, however, words simply aren't suitable. Scott died in 1940 believing he had failed. Their letters, those wild burning bits, survive, showing two people who loved like firecrackers, explosive, gorgeous, and ultimately doomed. Zelda died in a fire at her hospital 8 years later. A love immortalized in ink and ash, too great for the world in which they lived.